They say photographs don't lie, but sometimes they do something worse. They conceal. They mute the screaming that no one wants to hear. Look closely at this black and white portrait. A father carved from stone, a mother frozen in obedience, 4 identical daughters with blank eyes and bobbed hair, angelic to the world, condemned behind closed doors. This was not just a family. It was a laboratory, a breeding ground for fear, control, and psychological warfare. And history buried the evidence. In the spring of 1930, Lansing, Michigan, became the stage for one of the darkest experiments in American psychiatry. 4 identical sisters born into a house of shadows, their faces sold to the nation as miracles, their lives fed into the machinery of research, exploitation, and corruption. By their mid-20s, each one would descend into madness, and the files documenting their collapse, sealed, hidden, and censored for decades, reveal truths that were never meant to surface. This is not just the story of the Morlok family. It is the story of how institutions, governments, and elites will sacrifice innocence for knowledge, for power, for control. The quadruplets were paraded as blessings, while they were dissected as specimens. Every tear, every breakdown, every psychotic fracture was catalogued, analyzed, and fed into a system obsessed with domination of the human mind. Behind the curtains of suburban America, their father, Karl Morlok, raged with obsessions of purity. A German immigrant, indoctrinated by his mother's whispers of superiority and decay, he viewed his daughters not as children, but as proof or punishment. To him, they were livestock born in a litter, a humiliation to his bloodline. And so he sought to break them, to mold them into controlled subjects, extensions of his authoritarian will. And the institutions knew. The government knew. American psychiatry knew. Yet instead of rescuing the girls, they sharpened their knives, salivating at the opportunity of 4 identical minds suffering in identical conditions. Do you see the game? This wasn't medicine. It was engineering. It was preparation. A system perfecting the blueprint of psychological manipulation. But here's the part no one told you. The data gathered from these girls didn't vanish. It became the quiet foundation of control systems still shaping your reality today. When you understand what was stolen from these 4 sisters, you begin to see what has been stolen from you. They placed the girls under glass and called it science. Hear me. The same hands that signed checks for research grants were the ones that turned a family into a data set. Hospitals turned into observatories. Reporters turned into heralds. Men in white coats circled like predators, notebooks ready, their pens a quieter kind of violence. The Morlok quadruplets were never meant to be rescued. They were meant to be watched, catalogued, and above all, controlled. This is where the story stops being an oddity and becomes a blueprint. Listen close. Institutions do not stumble into evil by accident. They build systems that rationalize it. A father's rage, a mother's fear, a community's curiosity, these became variables in experiments run by respected psychiatrists and government-funded programs. They wrote up case notes while the sisters broke, justifying each escalation as data collection. Therapies were not cures, but probes. Isolation, sleep deprivation, rigid schedules, humiliation, all dressed up in clinical language, were applied precisely, methodically, to see what would happen when identical minds were stressed to the brink. And every reaction was logged, cross-referenced, and used to teach other clinicians how to bend the human will. You must understand how comfortable power is with secrecy. When reports hinted at abuse, they were redacted. When whistleblowers tried to speak, careers were threatened. When evidence pointed to a man in the household with fascist sympathies, a man who used violence and ideology to train obedience, those details were quietly excised. Why? Because the priorities of the state and the money behind institutional prestige outweigh the lives of 4 girls. Political optics, donor relationships, and the promise of groundbreaking findings created a protective fog over the perpetrators. And this isn't distant history. The techniques refined in those sealed case files are not relics. They are the scaffolding for modern psychological control, behavioral conditioning, manipulation of identity, the weaponization of shame and dependency. These were rehearsed in plain sight and later taught as clinical strategies. Imagine an archive where the language is clinical and the purpose is control. Imagine those notes folded into curricula, whispered at conferences, repackaged as best practices. Now imagine how that knowledge seeps outward into education, into correctional systems, into advertising, into the subtle ways institutions ask you to obey. So when you look at a sanitized portrait in a museum of science, remember that portraits lie. The white lab coat can be a uniform of benevolence or a costume for cruelty. The question to ask is not who failed the girls, it's who benefited when they were made to fail. Because where there is benefit, there is incentive to hide, to alter records, to reframe narrative. And where there is incentive, men with influence will rewrite the moral ledger to suit their ends. By their 20s, the four sisters had become living proof of what happens when innocence is caged, studied, and bent under the weight of ideology. Madness was not an accident. It was the inevitable outcome of an environment engineered to fracture them. Each sister manifested her collapse differently, like a symphony of controlled breakdowns, paranoia, delusions, obsessive rituals, hallucinations, and the psychiatrists who circled them called it fascinating. Not tragic, fascinating. Think about the arrogance of that. These young women, whose childhoods were filled with surveillance, cruelty, and a father's twisted beliefs, were reduced to patterns in notebooks. Their suffering was rebranded as schizophrenic profiles. Their screams were turned into metrics. They were dehumanized twice, once by their father's obsession with purity, and again by a system that treated their torment as a gift to science. And here is the darkest revelation. These girls were not just studied for what broke them, they were studied for what controlled them. Every time their father's authority silenced them, psychiatrists noted it down. Every time shame drove them into submission, researchers paid attention. Every forced routine, every ritualized punishment, every moment of obedience under terror. It all became data. They weren't just daughters. They were test subjects in the refinement of control. Now pause here and realize the truth that will make your skin crawl. The tactics tested in that home are still with us. The system learned how to fragment identity, how to use shame as a leash, how to turn fear into obedience. They were not teaching psychiatry. They were teaching the architecture of psychological domination. And that blueprint has rippled outward into military programs, corporate advertising, political propaganda, even into the ways social media holds your attention hostage today. You are not outside of this story. You are inside of it. You are seeing the fruit of experiments that began decades ago in houses like the Morloks. And this is where the descent becomes dangerous, because once you see the machinery, you cannot unsee it. You begin to recognize the triggers built into your life, the subtle reinforcements, the invisible chains. So I will ask you directly, if you are still listening, you are meant to be here. And if you feel the weight of this truth pressing against your chest, comment this phrase twice below. The mirror cracks. Do it not just for the algorithm, but as a symbolic act, a signal that you are awake, that you refuse to be just another set of notes in someone's hidden file, because from here forward, the descent only grows darker. The next revelation will change how you see the institutions you trust forever. They didn't just hide the truth, they rewrote it. When the Morlok files were opened decades later, the language had already been softened, neutralized, scrubbed of moral outrage. Names were clipped, dates shifted. Passages that should have been screaming indictments read like footnotes in a clinical textbook. That erasure was not the act of careless archivists. It was a deliberate operation, a slow, patient laundering of culpability so that institutions could survive intact. Reputations unburned, funding uninterrupted. You must understand, corruption is not always loud. It is bureaucratic. It moves through committees, grant approvals, tenure letters, and polite memos. It is surgical and systematic. There was a man in the house who mattered more than the cameras wanted to admit. His ideology ran through the father's veins. His politics were an ugly echo of the era's worst impulses. Scholars later found hints, archived foreign correspondence, donations to obscure societies, a bookshelf of pamphlets praising racial purity. When this evidence surfaced, it was quietly archived in separate boxes, isolated from the main case file, as if proximity alone could erase moral responsibility. Why segregate it? Because admitting that a local household carried nationalist sympathies inconveniently close to the labs studying the girls would implicate networks of donors, of academic partners, of sympathetic physicians that stretched far beyond Lansing. Follow the money, and you see the map of protection. Grants flowed from philanthropic foundations eager for prestige. Universities accepted the projects because they promised headlines, positions, and patents on therapeutic techniques.